Hi everyone, this podcast is brought to you by the Fantasy Animation Research Network. If you like what you hear and want to support the show even further, the best thing you can do for us right now is to leave us a short review and a star rating on the iTunes Store. It's very easy and takes no time at all. More ratings increases our visibility and gives us a better chance of reaching a wider audience. For more information about the network, visit fantasy-animation.org, where you can comment on our blog posts, have a route around our podcasts, and join the Fantasy Animation mailing list. But for now, we hope you enjoy the show.
That was the majestic score there from Bernard Herrmann's epic music, and you are listening to the Fantasy Animation Podcast with myself, Alex Sargent.
And myself, Christopher Holliday.
Yourself and myself,
yes.
Indeed. Welcome, everyone. Today we are discussing the Ray Harryhausen classic, Jason and the Argonauts, a very key seminal movie in the history of both fantasy animation. So we are keen to talk about and unpick its various intersections between its fantasy storyline and its animation subject. Chris, this is my pick for this week. You haven't seen it before until about 2 hours ago.
Yes, so I must confess that I am sort of torn between my identity as an animation scholar and also living with an identity of somebody who hasn't seen a large proportion of apparently all movies.
Listeners, I would stress all movies. This is hopefully going to become a running game on this podcast.
So, yes, Jason and the Argonauts was, as you say, your pick, but at the same time, it feels like a movie that's very much in my wheelhouse, and certainly any kind of animation studies scholar worth their salt will have heard of Harryhausen, Ray Harryhausen. The film, of course, obviously is directed by Don Chaffey, but I noticed that Harryhausen is credited as both associate producer and, quote, creator of visual effects. So hopefully when we're kind of talking and kind of going through the film, I can pick out some moments that are, I think, really important to the history of animation, history of particularly stop motion animation, looking at Harryhausen's particular dynamation process, so his way of working with the stop motion medium. So certainly if it's a seminal text for fantasy scholars, it is equally so for animation scholars too.
And just before I sort of introduce the movie to listeners, just as a sentence, what did you reckon of it?
I thought it was very tanned and sweaty.
Sure, as I am actually in this quite hot room on a summer morning, because we record these podcasts way in advance. So hopefully you are listening to this and it's chilly and cold and raining and snowing and all the things that British winter can bring.
Yeah.
At the moment I'm in my 3/4 length shorts and everything's a bit damp, a bit like this film.
Yes, so I did enjoy it. The animated sequences are very clearly, it's very much a film of visual effects, and certainly the status of the stop motion effects is folded into the narrative so that these sequences become moments of fantasy for us, but also for the characters on screen. I noticed that the animated sequences or the stop motion moments are very clearly bracketed within the film, so there are about 4 or 5 sequences that we can kind of go to specifically and look at as moments where we see animation. Having said that, there are all kinds of visual effects throughout the film. It is very much a film of its time in terms of some of the things that we see. So back projection, we see matte paintings and kind of fake backgrounds, a series of superimpositions, and also it's dubbing, and so I think that there are many effects within the film, some of which are invisible or meant to be read as invisible, whereas the animated effects are certainly there to be seen. These are moments that we kind of stop and stare and kind of take in as part of the spectacle.
I guess it brings me to a question before we haven't started. This is all the pre-title sequence, everyone. This is still the orchestral.
God, do let me know when we start, and I'll start.
This isn't it yet. This makes me interested in this idea of what is an animated special effect and what is a non-animated special effect. So you mentioned things like rear projection, split screen, I catched a few moments of sort of dissolves
Yes,
or
yes.
face, kind of very sort of early cinema effects here, splicing with the camera, all that kind of stuff. Well, what point would you, as an animation scholar, call one animation and one fantasy? Just because this is an audio format, everybody. Chris has just pulled a face at me, which because this is a family-friendly podcast, I can't translate into words.
Well, if I remember,
use your imagination.
If I remember, one of the previous podcast, you asked me a quote-unquote impossible question, and you've trumped yourself there.
Yeah.
I would say, I mean, film historians, cinema historians who talk about early film talk about moments of effects. So the word itself, cinema, as being itself an effect, but obviously the old narrative versus spectacle negotiation that occurred within early cinema, and certainly it's no coincidence that those scholars writing about early cinema and the role of spectacle and special effects are writing at a time in the late 70s, 80s where Hollywood is experimenting further with special effects, and we're starting to get the rise of computers. So it's one of those things where writing on the cinema of attractions by Tom Gunning and work on early cinema is as much about the period in which he is writing as it is the period that he's referring to. So it's really, for my money, I have a note as I was watching the film that stuff like back projection, matte paintings, dubbing, any kind of superimposition, scenes where we are getting the impression that events are either happening coexistently or to reflect a passage of time, a passing of time, when a lot of the rowing sequences take place, for example, that this to me, these wouldn't be called visual effects in the same way. So I'm sort of fudging the answer to your question, but it seems to be around, to my mind, visual effects. I'm thinking around the 70s and 80s, so the kind of blockbuster, post-classical blockbuster era of Jaws,
George the Shark and his merry men.
I was thinking of Sharky and George when I said Jaws. There we go. Close Encounters. Films like that. So I'm sort of. It's very much a sort of to my mind, a sort of visual effects. VFX is a sort of 70s and 80s phenomenon.
So this is sort of proto-example of that then?
Yeah, so this film is early 60s. Yeah. Though you asked me earlier about my response to the film, it stands up very well, and certainly the climactic fight sequence between Jason, the Argonauts, and this sort of army of skeletons is incredible, really, and really for a film that's made in 63 or 62, 63, it's terrific. So yes, it's this sort of I'm interested in the way that the film articulates its effects, folds effects into its narrative. Yeah. The effects for us are the effects for the characters, and also the coexistence of quote invisible effects that are in service of we're not supposed to notice that they're standing in front of a blue I suppose the equivalent of a blue screen or a green screen, a sort of back projection. So
yeah, I think there's two interesting things there, and I'll set up the movie now. And I made a lot of notes about how some of the attempts to incorporate the stop motion into the narrative becomes part of the narrative. We can talk about that as we go through the movie. And I'm also very interested in the question of how much we're supposed to notice and how much we're not supposed to notice the effects. I think that's also part of its identity as a fantasy film. But just to sort of give everyone the spiel, if people haven't heard of this movie, Jason the Argonauts is one of the early examples of a series of movies made throughout the 50s, 60s, 70s, and into the early 80s loosely by a figure named Ray Harryhausen. He's credited as various different things in these movies, often as a producer, as I say, I noted associate producer this time, or a creative director. But essentially he worked in partnership with another producer called Charles Schneer, and the two of them did various different deals, often with Columbia Studios, throughout the sort of 50s, 60s, 70s, making these kind of monster movies. And these monster movies were made through a process called dynamation, that's at least how they described it, which is a not necessarily innovative in terms of its animation style. It's using stop motion, which is a very early animation technology, and it goes right back to things like King Kong. But the blending of that with a sort of process by which live action could interact with these characters was very innovative for its time. And in terms of histories of fantasy, we get a narrative very similar to sort of histories of animation, in that a lot of people credit Harryhausen with both being a technical pioneer. He's the guy that invented a way of doing things on screen whereby live action and these sort of monsters made through plasticine could interact with one another. And this is perhaps the film that features his most famous and perhaps his most technically accomplished version of that, which is this massive skeleton fight at the end of the movie, which I'm sure we'll get to. From my perspective, I'm very interested in that. Quite often, Harryhausen, even in histories of fantasy, isn't considered as someone who's particularly interested in the genre in which he is working, in that he is often considered to be a technical pioneer, and actually his influence on fantasy cinema is actually his influence on later fantasy filmmakers. So people like Steven Spielberg credit Harryhausen as being a really important influence, and even people like Peter Jackson. Peter Jackson described The Lord of the Rings, The Fellowship of the Ring, as his Ray Harryhausen movie. And the beats of that movie are actually quite similar to something like this. But actually, I think that's perhaps downplaying his interest in fantasy and fantasy fiction. His autobiography is full of discussions of fantasy. I think he says in it at one point, if it weren't for the genre of fantasy, I wouldn't be a filmmaker. Fantasy is my inspiration and my muse. He was interested in early stop motion, but he was also interested in early comic book artists, early versions of fantasy storytelling, early pulp magazines. So I'll be looking at ways in which we can consider him to be interested in the genre whilst evolving at a technical level. I don't see him as just a technician. I see him as someone very much interested in the stories he's telling.
So this is a film, and certainly for us, occupies that middle ground between an overlap between fantasy and animation. That Harryhausen certainly has a foot in both camps. He is a pioneer of, certainly from an animation historian's perspective, he is a pioneer of particular kinds of animated effects. So this dynamation process that involved is essentially a split screen layered. We've talked previously about Disney's multiplane camera. He's using a certain kind of split screen to give the impression of certain degrees of action and interaction between human elements, live action elements, and animated elements. So he's a pioneer of certain kinds of animated effects, and ultimately perhaps used fantasy as an outlet to express that kind of technological artistry, yet at the same time he is a fantasy filmmaker working within those kinds of traditions, and the best way, a productive way of articulating some of the codes, conventions, tropes, character archetypes within fantasy is to therefore use a particular kind of medium, in this case animation, and actually in this case stop motion animation. So he is very much a figure who is certainly central to both historical narratives simultaneously rather than one or the other. And actually going through the film, thinking about Jason and the Argonauts, it's really a checklist of things that animation can do. So stuff from metamorphosis and kind of teleportation. It plays with issues of enlargement, of miniaturization. Clearly there is some really intricate model work. There's some nice stuff with fire. So it's a really interesting, in terms of the creative language of animation, it's very much pushing at the boundaries of some of the things that medium can do. And is it using fantasy to do that, or is it sort of the other way around? Is it both? So I think it's a terrific film to look at. So well chosen.
Yeah, I mean it's almost like we did that on purpose.
It is.
So we should get going, I guess. So we'll go through the film beat by beat. So it starts, as I say, with this credit for Harryhausen as associate producer. I love old movie credit sequences. I love a film where nothing happens for 5 minutes, but we just get some music and lovely fonts. I'm a big font fan, Chris, and we get this sort of Bernard Herrmann score playing, which I'm a massive fan of. It really settles you into the movie. But I also noticed whilst watching the credits, we get images of sort of old Greek pots, old Greek architecture, lots of still images of things. Chris is nodding enthusiastically. I'll stop speaking now.
No, I'm. It's more than enthusiasm. No, to pick up on a couple of things that you said, I noticed. The score is terrific, and Herman had just come off of working on Psycho and a couple of other Hitchcock movies. So this is a very brass-heavy score. And the other thing I noticed, I've just put that the murals that we see and these sorts of, as you say, still images are, to me, they are, I guess, a precursor, or they kind of come off of the back of the storybook. So the storybook that begins Snow White that we've talked about previously, here we've got a different kind of visual narration, and then it perhaps anticipates some of the other uses of Disney when they're using, because I've heard you mention before Beauty and the Beast and the way that they use the stained glass window and just kind of show this visual narration. Certainly the 50s itself, 50s and 60s are a time in Hollywood especially. This is an independent movie, but certainly in Hollywood the 50s and 60s is a time where the title sequence is going bonkers, thanks to Saul Bass, his work on Hitchcock, and also the Bond movies. So title sequences are becoming really interesting spaces, and historians of Hollywood, so we're thinking of Bordwell, David Bordwell, Kristen Thompson, Janet Steiger, in their book on classical Hollywood, mention that although classical Hollywood is very standardized, it's very sort of formulaic in many ways, where we're seeing really experimental moments are actually in title sequences. That's where we're allowed to see things that are a bit wacky. So yeah, I think that the film has this really lovely opening sequence that has that kind of plays out through the credits.
Yeah, and it's doing lots of things because it's foreshadowing what's to come. In that we have this stillness of images, which is foreshadowing the movement, the dynamism that we're about to get. And I think the first 20 minutes, half an hour of the movie struck me. There are so many shots of characters looking at things that we think are about to be animated and are not. I don't know if that's just me projecting onto the movie, but bear in mind that this is a few movies in for Harryhausen. You probably are becoming slightly aware of it. We've got lots of characters looking at statues, looking at images that we think are about to come to life and don't, and yet somehow seem almost animated in the process. So it's foreshadowing what's to come. It's also sort of harking back to this historical, iconography of gods, mythology, all this stuff that it is now going to tell on screen. So I think it's doing something very interesting with the subject matter in that moment, and it sets up this sort of prologue where we get a soothsayer who tells us the story of what's to come. Basically tells us exactly what's about to happen in the movie in that classic sort of Greek chorus manner. We get a soothsayer saying, you will become king, but Jason, it's setting up the myth of Jason and the Argonauts. I don't think we need to necessarily go too much into the nitty-gritty of it, and setting up the mythology of this world very nicely. So it becomes a film about visual storytelling in many ways, shape or form. And I think I found that quite interesting. There's lots of stuff in this movie about characters moving other characters, power relationships between gods and humans, gods playing humans like little puppets, of humans with magical gifts playing other humans like little puppets, and there's a sort of really interesting relationship between animators on screen and animators off screen.
Yes, the last, and it actually only really struck me in the final sequence of the film, which we won't jump to now. But I've just written gods as animators ? Bracket questions of creativity and control. That it only really struck me at the end that these are sort of godlike characters who are playing, as you say, these human figures like puppets. What also struck me about the film is thinking about our own identity as people interested in fantasy and animation, and certainly this approach to thinking about the relationship or the interrelationship between fantasy and animation has certainly made me feel very reflexive about how, where and why animation is used in particular kinds of filmmaking contexts. And it's almost as if that sort of spectatorial experience was seemingly being fed into the film. So, as you say, there are lots of instances where characters are looking, but they are looking at things that we might expect to become animated and become full of life. And so that reflexivity... That,
do you want to just give the listeners some examples?
Well, certainly up until the first moment where they are fight Talos, so this big kind of bronze statue, that immediate bit before... I was waiting for all of those bronze statues to come alive, and they're sort of lined up in this and posed as a foe to Jason within the film itself. And
there are other moments in there. For example, towards the beginning of the film, there's a big statue of Hera that I hadn't seen the movie in quite a long time. I was convinced that she was about to stand up. I think I might be confusing it with another Harryhausen movie. Please do write in and tell us, or tweet me and remind me which one that is, and I'm sure we'll get to it at some point in 2025 when we're still sitting here. Hopefully it won't be quite as hot then.
Yeah, and it'll be a different podcast as well.
Yeah. We're snazzier.
Well,
that Hera statue. We also get the Hera figure mask.
Yes,
and she is sort of animated, but not quite. The eyes move. They look. but it's sort of all setting up this moment, you're right, where the big bronze Telos statue stands up as these other statues stay still.
I mean, it's very easy to sort of say that the film is about animation, but then at the same time, as you say, that sort of mast that's pointing the wrong way on the boat, looking back rather than looking outwards of Hera. There are obviously moments where she communicates, and it's kind of done through sound design and dubbing, and then blinks up the eyes occasionally. So she's animated, but not in the same way. So it's perhaps not that the film is overtly reflexive about animation as a medium, but it's certainly giving us different registers of creativity, control, agency that culminate in the sort of 4 or 5 sequences where we are seeing, or maybe it's kind of qualified through fantastical creatures. Like the proper animation in the film is reserved for the armory of fantasy creatures, the kind of the winged thing, monster,
harpy-ish thing,
the multi-headed lizard, snaky thing, the bronze statue that fights and is this kind of giant. So I'm wondering whether
listeners want to buy the multi-headed lizard snaky thing T-shirts for this podcast, they're available on our. No, they're not really.
So I'm wondering, whether the proper animation is being deliberately delayed or. I don't know. The other issue is the time-consuming nature of animation itself.
Can I throw a fantasy note at this point?
I'd love you to.
Because I'm interested in dual agency as well, in that this is also a film about Greek mythology, and it does take license with the mythology, but it doesn't take quite as much license as you might think. It's relatively faithful. He uses the word relative in a sort of very italicized manner and a very Hollywood manner, in the sense that it is in at least some way faithful, whilst also taking huge divergence. So Medea is in no way like Medea in classical mythology, but it is there, and they have taken some effort to remain faithful. And I'm also interested in the slippage between fantasy storytelling and theological storytelling. So one of the perhaps prototypical examples of fantasy is the Iliad. Homer's Iliad. It's probably the first story we have written down in Western civilization, and you can argue that it is a fantasy story and that it is a story about things that do not exist happening. The only complication to that is that obviously it is written during a period whereby the people receiving that literature would have believed in the stuff that's happening.
Have you come to pray to the gods, Jason?
If I had, I wouldn't have chosen a fallen one.
Only a statue. Sometimes the gods argue amongst themselves. Then great winds blow and temples fall.
Hermes.
A bringer of dreams and a prowler of the night. Jason! No man can tell you how to find the fleece. Is it not time you ask the gods?
They will not answer those who believe in them. Why should they answer one who doesn't?
Oh, sorry, Jason and/or his Argonauts. I just wanted to interrupt to talk a little bit about the Fantasy Animation Research Network, but in particular an upcoming event that might be of interest to our listeners.
Yeah, we're very excited to plug this here. If you are in the London area or would like to travel to the London area, on Monday the 10th of September at 6:30pm, Chris and I will be doing a talk at the BFI South Bank Cinema. So for those who don't know that, that's the cinema, the lovely South Bank Cinema, right on the front, opposite, I believe, a Wagamama's.
Yes. So that's
also tempting, a pre-dinner snack, and then a post-dinner chat about all things fantasy animation at the BFI Library, where Chris and I will be hosting a talk, along with some other contributors, to celebrate our book, Fantasy Animation: Connections Between Media, Mediums and Genres.
More information about the event can be found on the BFI website, and we'll also post a little link on the Fantasy Animation website as well.
You can also find it on our Twitter feed and Facebook group, so please check that out as well. We hope to see as many of you down there as possible for the talk and perhaps a beer afterwards. If you can't get involved because you live too far away or for whatever reason, another way to participate in the event would be to send us questions in advance. You can do this on our Facebook page or our Twitter page. simply use the hashtag FANANIM. So that's FANANIM, FANANIM.
And please make the questions more than where are the places to eat near here.
That would be helpful, yes. Let's get back to the show. Basically, I'm interested in this thorny issue between when does a fantasy story become a work of theology? Does it have to, if it mentions a character for mythology, does that make it a myth rather than a fantasy and all this kind of stuff? And I think the nice middle ground we might reach is, what I sort of see it as, and a lot of other scholars before me, John Calabesk writes about this quite a lot, is it using the religious iconography to affirm a particular religious worldview? So is it asking us to believe in the gods, or is it using the religious iconography to play with our imaginative sensibility and play with our sense of imagination? And I argue this film is quite firmly doing the latter because it's obviously not set at the same time. So I guess the long and the short of it is that I think what's very interesting is the way they use gods here speaks to two types of agency: human agency and some sort of supernatural agency, right? The figure of the supernatural being a really important figure in all fantasy literature as a character that can do more things, be more things, can be dominant over everything. So we constantly have this interplay between the will of the gods, the power of the gods, and the power of humans. And that is a key feature of all fantasy literature that is set in a theological mold, be it Greek mythology or even things like It's a Wonderful Life and stuff like that.
I mean, for me, it's interesting where or the register of the film, the parts of the film that we're invited to read as supernatural. So there's sort of the kind of three camps, if you like, or there is a tension in the film between three camps. There is the world of Jason on Earth, there is the world of the gods up high, and then there is this space in between where the animation exists. And the film is about the interplay between these three elements. So you have Jason on Earth, who is being confronted by these certain kinds of kind of supernatural events, but events that we're deliberately asked and invited to read as moments of fantasy, as impossible. Certainly moments.
So you're talking when the statue comes alive,
yes,
when the harpies arrive, when the skeletons rise up from the.
These are in ways. Intrusions onto that world. These are not part of. This is not a world where everything can come to life, but at the same time, it just feels to me that these are particular moments that the characters themselves are reading as unusual within the context of their own space.
It's intrusive, not immersive, isn't
yes.
it? It's oh my god, this is happening. This shouldn't be happening in this world, and it is, and that's diegetically fed within the narrative. Jason reacts in disbelief.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. So there are moments like that, absolutely.
Yes. So I think there's some really.
But there are other moments when, for example, Jason encounters Zeus, and we get that really weird moment where sort of Jason is a little figure on his chessboard, where. It's much more ambiguous, right?
Certainly, it feels to me that's. It seems like something that's happened before in that world.
Yeah.
That there are exceptions. So actually, fantasy becomes a really interesting element within the film that's kind of weaved in and out to show. I don't know. There's two kinds of fantasy,
and there's and to riff on that, there's two types of animation, right? So there's the most overt examples of the animation are in these intrusive moments.
Yes.
Whilst the more sort of nebulous special effects
that we're invited to read as part of the illusion and ultimately it's not really effects at all in some sense, are being connected to events within the film that are qualified actually within the film as not fantasy at all.
Jason's allowed to talk to Zeus in this world because that fits the internal logic of this world.
Yes.
It fits the internal logic of this world that if you pray to Hera, she speaks back to you.
Yes.
But it doesn't fit the internal logic world if the statue comes to life or if the skeletons rise to the ground. And that's very interesting. I hadn't thought about this until with this moment, but it's interesting. They're using different visual methods to depict that on screen.
So I've got as a sort of the Talos statue, the bronze statue comes to life after about 25 minutes, something like that.
Yeah, I haven't done the plot, but I'll do it in a sentence. So Jason's got to get the golden fleece. He goes through a bunch of challenges to get it. He gets it. End. That's the beats done, right?
Yes.
And what we get sort of is a very episodic set of situations. They go from island to island, situation to situation, where different things are told. So the Telos moment we keep mentioning is on the sort of they've stopped for water, and then Then Hercules. I really want to talk about Hercules.
Yes.
I love. Every time I watch this movie, I forget that Hercules is in it, and I have no idea who plays him. I'm going to find out actually, but it is a mixture between the sort of love child of Brian Blessed and Charles Dance. It's sort of this, it's that '60s masculinity that just means hairy and kind of like your slightly pervy uncle.
I will refer you to my tanned and sweaty comment earlier. No, what I was going to say is that if the Talos statue moment is 20-25 minutes into the film, it's up until that point we've had sort of invisible effects. So we've had moments of enlargement and miniaturization. We've had examples where we're supposed to be seeing metamorphosis. We're supposed to be seeing kind of teleportation and certainly some of the rules of the rules of the world. 30 minutes in or so, this is the moment that this is payoff number one, and the scene is set to. It's obviously the whole film is set up as a journey narrative, an extended journey narrative, and that allows the film to quite episodically structure a series of set pieces around certain kinds of animated sequences. So there are a handful of scenes and sequences in the film that are kind of their charge comes from, they are structured around the moment of wonder connected to certain kinds of effects. So the Talos statue that starts to begin to move, it climbs up from its plinth, it picks up the boat. These are moments that are framed as unusual and spectacular within the film itself. And for us, part of that spectacle comes from the animated artifact coexisting within the same shot and seemingly having a degree of consequence and impact on the live action footage. So that's really why I thought that the animated effects were terrific. I felt coexistence. I didn't feel a kind of rupture between the live action and animated elements. There was some really nice interplay. It was King Kong grabbing Fay Ray all over again and feeling her in his hand.
I think that's a really striking bit, the Telos sequence, and I think it's something to do with the stillness of it and the build up to it and the fact that it sort of slowly builds out of this statue. You see it still for a very long time and then it moves very gradually. There's something about that sequence is really, really striking.
But isn't it important then that one of the key or most significant elements of the film's animation is its use of non-animation or de-animation? So it would feel different if the statue or the statue was already sentient when it encountered Jason. It's really important that the characters and also us, Toy Story is the same principle. If the toys just began the film and they were talking, and then it doesn't have that same. It's really important that the illusion of life element of animation is itself made a spectacle of. We are seeing things come to life, and it is really important that the statue is first seen in its original proper form before it comes to life. And
it's important actually that's really, because I think there's basically sort of three big set pieces involved management, and I think that by far the least successful is that middle one involving the harpies thing, these sort of winged creatures. And you're right, that one starts with them already existing.
Yes.
There is no moment where they are animated on screen, they come to life on screen. But I guess that process of animation, it does two things, doesn't it? One, it spectacularizes the technology.
Yes.
And I think if you read reviews at the time, a lot of people were very aware of this technology. They were very aware that that's the point of the movie. They describe watching it as very sort of dreamlike, very strange kind of experience. So there is a certain, spectacularization of the experience of watching it. And I think also, in terms of the fantasy, it animates that relationship between gods and men, that relationship between the natural and the supernatural, and the intrusive and the immersive, right?
Yes.
The intrusive moments are when things are presented diegetically as not animated and then made to be animated.
So we're saying that the kind of winged harpy that can fly are creatures of that world, as opposed to the statue who has been created to be sentient within that
Certainly,
world.
I'm not sure if that's how it's meant to be in the narrative, but that's how it feels watching it. They feel very normal and actually very unconvincing. Not that they're necessarily meant to be convincing, they feel just very inert on screen, those things. They look like plasticine blobs to me, and they don't seem that successfully integrated within the characters.
Yes.
Whilst the other monsters, the Hydra, the Skeleton Army, Telos, they all work for me quite well.
Yes. No, I think that the success of the film, because it's very difficult, certainly within a more contemporary digital context, to create a sense of weight and volume. Digital images have no volume; they have no weight, and so to try and think about how you represent volume and solidity and how do we know a character is strong? Watching this, and I wonder whether this comes from the stop motion element, there was a real sense of materiality. So when that bronze statue raises and starts kind of marching, and there was a real consequence to when he puts his foot down and kind of squashes these human characters. So there was I get a real sense of volume and materiality, and I'm wondering within the character, and I'm wondering whether that is a function of that stop motion is a very particular kind of frame by frame animation. Previously, we've talked about forms of cell animation, but the stop motion element to the film is really important to give that solidity to the animated components, and it's really that three-dimensionality that stop motion exists. The objects of stop motion exist in front of the camera. It's only through the special powers of the medium that they come to life. They exist as sort of objects to touch and hold. So yeah, I get a real sense of their volume, and that helps. This is a film I feel that could only be done in stop motion. It would feel very different and almost inconsequential were it to be remake now with
the remake of Clash of the Titans might speak to this, and that people who went on about how it was a rubbish story and naff and really badly acted, well, the original one has all those problems going on as well, but so does this film. I mean, the acting is atrocious from start to finish. The lead actor playing Jason, his name escapes me. By the way, anyone interested, the person who plays Hercules, his name is Nigel Green, and he died 10 years later at the age of 47, so this podcast is dedicated to him. And he was also the captain in Zulu. Have you seen Zulu?
I have. Well, going back to an earlier comment about films I haven't seen, of course I haven't seen Zulu.
Sure.
Carry on.
That would be a tenuous link to do for this podcast, but I'll try and crowbar it in, guys, because I love Zulu very much. But the main character is Todd Armstrong, who I don't know what else he went on to, dubbed by someone else, by Tim Turner. I don't know who that is, but he's terrific. What else has he done? He has done films as good as The Rat King, Sculp Lock, The Iron Horse, A Time for Killing,
and thankfully Hawaii Five-0.
And a couple of us Hawaii Five-0. Terrific. So yeah, it's not great acting. It's not great characterization.
I tell you, the best bit of acting, the best bits of the film.
I really hope you're going to say what I think you're going to say.
Are the moments where they're interacting with the animation for me.
Yeah.
Sure. That obviously wasn't what you were going to say.
No, I want you to say Honor Blackman, but that's for other reasons.
But no, I think that the bits where the human element is the strongest is when we're seeing the fight sequences and the sense of conflict and confrontation with these animated components, because I think the layering of the live action and animated elements or artifacts in the film are really successful, and actually they need to be successful to use the sort of King Kong analogy again. The stakes of the film are much more significant or raised if we know Fay Ray is within the hand of an animal, and so we really need to. There needs to be a sense of jeopardy, and actually the role of the animation was successful enough to sustain the jeopardy of the film, which is why that climactic set piece is so effective.
Absolutely, yeah, I agree. I think it comes to life in those moments, doesn't it? And that's what we're all waiting for. And that's basically the film knows that it's structured in such a way as to get on to the next. Once we get the first half an hour of build up, and then it's just set piece after set piece after set piece.
These are set pieces, as I said, that are organised around moments of animation. So we have the statue, we have these winged creatures, then we have this snake
let's talk
dragon.
about the Hydra sort of dragony thing sequence. Right, so this is it's the guardian of the Golden Fleece. Jason's sort of reached the end of his quest at this point. He's being pursued by an army, and he comes across this snake monster thing, many-headed creature. Anything strike you in particular about that sequence?
Yes, it was the. I'm so glad you asked me that. It's a great.
I'm so glad I asked it because I was struggling to think of something.
So strap in. Yeah. So yes, this is a kind of terrifically shot and very tense scene, I think, and really is the culmination in terms of the narrative that this is the end of their journey, if not the end of the film, as we'll find out. It is the moment where Jason himself becomes an animated figure. So I found that really interesting, that we have this is the moment where as Jason is sort of fighting this strange, multi-headed serpent type thing. At one point, the serpent grabs him by the tail, and he becomes an animated figure.
And
really,
literally, he's a stop motion. He becomes a stop because obviously he's having to be held in the claws of this character. Yeah.
So we have close-ups of him as a human actor, if you like, being held within this tail as he fights it off. But then the longer shots have the whole scene as animated. So for that brief moment, it becomes animation in its entirety. So yes, it's the first moment and the only moment, I think, in the film where Jason becomes equally as animated as the creatures. This is the moment of human fantasy, if you like.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. There's another moment where an antagonist is also animated in the same sequence, actually.
Right.
But I think you're right. And Harryhausen would play with that a little bit more. Clash of the Titans we'll get to at some point, but Clash of the Titans has a character in it that constantly goes back and forth between being animated and being live action, depending on if you get a close up or if you get a full body shot. You get an actor playing them versus a animated monster.
So does that complicate the sort of assumption, or certainly my knowledge of Harryhausen is that these are movies, and then the fantasy elements are the creatures, the fantastical, strange, otherworldly, not possible creatures. That's really interesting. That actually a moment in a Harryhausen film that is animated is not fantasy in the same way that the fantasy is not being, or the animation is not being reserved for fantastical creatures. It's also being given over to the human characters as well.
Yeah, I guess you're right. Yeah, that is often how the story's told, isn't it? You sort of get it's a monster movie, series of monsters, which is true. But actually, I don't think this is a fantasy. I don't think it starts becoming a fantasy when Telos starts standing up. It's a fantasy from the outset. It's a mythological fantasy.
So is that what the opening title sequence then does? It establishes the narrative, but establishes the genre?
Establishes the world as well, right? This is a world of Greek myth and legend.
Yeah.
We're going to play with that world. And, throughout these 20 minutes, we're not getting animated sequences, but we're getting gods interacting with men, gods performing miracles, people performing prophecies. But I think the only difference is the rhetoric is different.
Yes.
It's immersive rather than intrusive. We keep going back to these distinctions because they're really, really helpful. Thank you to Farah Mendelsohn for inventing them. They're sort of helpful ways of clarifying what the different kinds of fantasy rhetoric are going on. So it's when it's intrusive that it becomes animated.
Yes.
But I think Harryhausen, and the other thing I would just briefly say is that Harryhausen isn't the director on this, although he basically is, in that he's involved in the script process. He is driving it. I think, depending on which account you read, it's slightly different, but quite often he would develop the monsters and they'd fit them into the script, or he'd read a basic outline of the script and then develop monsters in response to that. He would often direct the live action performance of the animated sequences. So if the live action shots of them fighting thin air, he would have directed, because both on a technical level, he needs to, so he can fit the dynamation into it and around it. He knows where they need to stand, all this kind of stuff. But I wonder if he's not getting enough sort of artistic credit in that. And I also think there's a spirit of a particular lens or type of fantasy that he's doing that a lot of filmmakers aren't doing at this time. We're talking about intrusive. It's really interesting. 1950s, 1960s Hollywood is the period of intrusive fantasies. Not all of them, but most mainstream fantasies that are being made in Hollywood are intrusive fantasies. So, Bedknobs and Broomsticks, Mary Poppins, these kind of movies are being made, where real life, primary world fantasies where an intrusive element comes in. And what these films are doing is using that same rhetoric, but within an already fantasy world.
Yes.
And they're doing it to speak to a much more marginal youth audience that are raised on sort of B-movie serials and are still operating within this isn't blockbuster filmmaking here. This is minor, low budget studio, outside studio interference filmmaking.
But isn't it interesting that, to go back to something you said about Harryhausen and the different views and questionable accounts of his role, and did he write or conduct the animation to fit it seems like that fantasy animation has this sort of necessary set of discourses that surround it. The way that Harryhausen's input in the film seems to be framed is very similar to this sort of going back to early film history and figures like Georges Méliès, and he very famously said that he considers kind of the narrative event is inconsequential. For him, he's kind of constructing the effects first and then building a narrative out of that, whereas you could flip it on its head and said the narrative was conceived first and then the effects were used to fit that. So it seems like fantasy animation has these almost a requisite set of discourses about which came first, which was being made to fit the other thing.
Yeah.
And so it seems like these sorts of debates are happening within the context of Harryhausen. Is he the animator that gave an outlet to fantasy expression, or is he somebody who is being given a fantasy script and then trying to find ways of articulating that on screen?
I guess the third way you can offer from that is that we often think of this dichotomy, and I say we, literally me and you, when we've had previous conversations about this, often think of this dichotomy between animation and fantasy as a relationship between effect and narrative.
Yes.
The narrative is the sort of engine, which one is the power, all this kind of stuff. I don't think this film's that interested in narrative.
No.
But I do think it's interested in fantasy. So I guess the third way is that why don't we think of, and we as scholars think of, devising a new trick for a movie as a moment of fantasy creativity? Designing a monster is an act of fantasy, is it
Yes.
not? It's not an act of a technician necessarily. It is a technical act, but it's not just an act of craftsmanship. It's an act of an imagination. You have to design a monster. That's an act of that's the same thing as kids drawing pictures in their notebooks. It's the I mean, that's why a lot of kids want to become animators, is this idea of drawing pictures. But what they're drawing is an expression of their own imagination. It's not an expression of their own relationship with clay.
Yes.
So I, to me, think that the third grandmother, he is an animator that brings to life moments of fantasy through stop motion. Do we have anything else to say about the skeleton sequence? Because I feel we haven't talked about it, and that's pretty much the reason we picked this movie.
Yes. So I had sort of been waiting for this moment, this sort of 3-minute that probably took months, years to produce, but is this sort of simply because I'd seen it, but in other contexts. So I'd seen it. I felt like I'd seen it in Tim Burton. I felt like, and he's very influenced by Harryhausen, and Tim Burton's video that he directed for the Killers for their song Bones is a tribute to this climactic sequence. So this fight between Jason and his pirates, as they are called in the film, and these sort of sentient skeletons is really framed visually, formally, aesthetically, stylistically as a confrontation with animation. So the seeds, the teeth are planted in the ground, and ultimately these skeletons appear, but they appear front on. So we have this really interesting tableau that is suddenly being populated. It is Disney's skeleton dance all over again, and they appear, fill the screen from left to right, and then you have quite an extended sort of 2-minute sequence where it's just a fight sequence. It's just a fight sequence between the pirates, between Jason. It made me laugh that a skeleton had the ability to be stabbed in the chest and die. That made me
literally never thought about that.
And drown as well.
Oh, by the way, and you've that's strike one. I'm going to keep record on this podcast. Strike one, everybody, write that down. God, the bit where the skeleton stood up was fine, but the bit where we stabbed him and it fell down, it made no sense.
Yes.
Then,
It was biologically...
Internal rules are really important.
Biologically inconsistent. So yes, and again, I think it's deliberately framed as a supernatural moment of fantasy within the film. This is not something... This is conjured by magic and prompts wonder. And so yeah, I thought it was a really terrific way to end the film. It plays with issues of obviously creativity and control, as we've said, and anticipates the epilogue to the film where it's about the gods and they reflect on the effectively the film that they've just seen, the film that they've just authored in some senses. Yeah. And so, as I said, this is a fantasy event where we are seeing a kind of conflict between live action and animation, life and death. Two forms of sentience. It's violent. A couple of the characters do perish, but ultimately, apparently, and who knew that skeletons could drown?
Well, quite. I think on Skeletons Can Drown, though, seems like a good point to conclude this discussion for today. So, Chris, thank you very much for trekking through Jason and the Argonauts. Perhaps we'll get round for another Harryhausen further down the line, but thank you for popping your Harryhausen cherry with me.
Thank you very much for putting it, well, one, for introducing me to Harryhausen in that sense, but also putting it in that delightful way.
And we'll be back next time on the Fantasy Animation Podcast. Until then, take care.
Thank you, bye.